In this video, we're going to be going over the hardest Mythic Plus dungeons to have ever existed in WoW. To keep it simple, we'll be trying to not include affixes and determining what made it difficult, as things like Fortified and Bolstering make every key difficult no matter what. The list will mostly just be going over the amount of failed keys and just general avoidance and attempting them for all levels of play, because of how difficult they were before the consideration of affixes, and we'll at most talk about the base affixes Fortified and Tyrannical. This list is also entirely subjective. This list is general to consider every type of person and how it ranges from casual to the high end. To start off our list, we have Mechagon Workshop. This dungeon would be the second part of the split Mega Dungeon and come with another heap of bosses and challenging trash to beat. In the beginning of the dungeon, you'd be prompted into an arena where an already dangerous track pack of mobs exists. What made this trash so difficult was the Bomb Tonk mob. This mob would have an uninterruptible cast called Detonate that when completed would cause massive group damage. You could stun the cast, but it would begin to cast it again immediately afterwards. The advantage to this group were the various hammers around the arena that you would use for the upcoming fight, and they could non-stop stun and deal heavy damage to the trash. The only problem with this strategy was the bombs often still got their cast off, and trying to fight them on fortified weeks could almost guarantee death in your groups if not careful. In higher keys, players would have the tank go entirely alone just to have the hammer and do all the work and no one die in the process due to LOS. After this, you must face off against the Tussle Tonks bosses, where one must be kited into the hammers by the tank and the DPS and healer must fight the No Mercy boss while avoiding its charge and flames jet that deal heavy damage. After this, you would be sent down further into the dungeon and be forced to fight the Waste Processing Unit, a mob with lots of frontal avoidance and the Living Waste Trash. This trash would explode on death and leave heavy dots on the group. Sometimes the result of what feels like a one-shot because of scaling. Cujo would be the next boss, and the main gimmick was lots of LOSing because the room would become too hot and you need to hide behind a box that would spawn. If you wouldn't hide behind the box, you would surely die quickly and must avoid the leaps of the bosses at the same time, as leaping onto a box would destroy it and leave you without an LOS, wiping the group in the process. This required good room management with your group, and once you managed to bring them down, you'd progress through more trash and a unique gauntlet. Here, you would need to avoid the red circles of the alarm bots, as touching them would stun you and send you back to the beginning. For a good chunk of players, this maze would keep people stuck for many minutes at a time and slow the attempt at timing the keystone greatly. There was no real way to cheese the bots, as a Warlock Gateway or Heroic Leap from a Warrior would still trigger the bots when you fly past them. Once you dealt with the headache that was the maze of alarm bots, you would face off against Sparkflux and deal with lots of dodging mechanics. Because you had to spend so much time dodging mechanics on this fight, the damage on the boss would slow down tremendously, and at this point you might already be behind on your timer. In addition, Sparkflux spawns ads that will deal damage and must be focused down, taking more attention away from the boss himself. After defeating this boss, you'd progress through arguably the hardest trash in the dungeon. The Workshop Defenders would leave a nasty bleed dot on you. Tinkers would summon explosive squirrels that must be dodged, or you'll be one-shot, and the defense bots with crazy hard-hitting AoE abilities that cannot be outranged. After this, you'd fight Mechagon himself and be put into a two-phase encounter. Phase 1 involves lots of dodging and running away from the boss, but Phase 2 amplifies this by incorporating a massive laser that players cannot be hit twice by. He'd attempt to pull players into uncomfortable positions to get them hit and generally have lots of HP to stall players' timers. Overall, the dungeon isn't the hardest to ever exist in WoW's history, but is infamously known among the more casual side of players who destroy pug groups due to unaware players, even at the lower end of keystone levels. What can be mainly attributed to the failed attempts at Workshop is after guiding new players through the maze, you'd be prompted with more difficult spectrum of bosses and potentially wipe. If you wiped, you would need to go through the maze again, and it just generally made players leave a key after only 1 or 2 wipes. And at number 9, we have the Temple of the Jade Serpent. This dungeon would originally be added into WoW during Mists of Pandaria, a time where the idea of Mythic Plus was only just beginning in the form of challenge modes. In Dragonflight Season 1, this dungeon would be remade somewhat into a more modern version to fit WoW's current standards, but in the process would become much more difficult for players. The most notable of changes throughout the dungeon was the increase in mob density overall and the reworked bosses. For example, when you face off against Wise Mari, normally you must defeat water elemental ads and then you're able to damage the boss himself. In the Mythic Plus variant, Wise Mari would actually take damage right away, but did many more mechanics. The most dangerous thing was if you stood in the water during this fight at the wrong time, he would throw your character into the air and deal massive damage to you. While in the air, you may fall into his frontal water beam that rotates 360 degrees around himself and you die in just a few seconds. Right away, this dungeon was difficult on players of any skill level because the bosses were entirely reworked, and habits they may have once had to kill these years-old bosses now must be changed in very new ways. Because the first boss was already challenging to most, keys could fail almost instantly, and pug players would leave after a few wipes, especially in Tyrannical weeks. If you managed to get past Wise Mari, you would then combat many more trash packs of lethal nature. and these also would be semi-reworked. Players being forced into relearning a dungeon that had existed for many years would throw lots of veterans into a loop, especially veteran casual players. They would enter the keystone assuming it was the exact same but with added health and affixes from any other keystone, but find the entire dungeon had been revamped. It created a pretty big learning curve in players, and when you would invite a pug, you were unsure if someone had actually seen the new version of the dungeon or not, meaning you may have to teach them as you go to actually time your key. The most dangerous the dungeon gets is the boss room of the third boss. When you arrive there, you're greeted with many more mobs than before, and each one has capabilities to leave your group defenseless and killed quickly. The most important would be the haunting screamcast, which could be interrupted but would fear you for 6 seconds if not, potentially pushing your character into other packs of mobs, making the room even more difficult to approach. This meant you either had to play risky and pull everything at once and coordinate with your group AoE stuns and interrupts, or play safe and pull one pack at a time but at the cost of more time on your key. Once you dealt with the packs and killed the boss, who was actually relatively simple to beat, just lots of healing and dodging, you would fight another pack similar to the last room. You either pull slow to go safe or go crazy to make up on time. The final boss was relatively simple, but the longer the fight went on, the more your healer would struggle to keep up, as dispels were very crucial in this portion. Without dispels, your group would just take infinitely more damage, and they would lose mana very quickly, wiping the group. To an experienced and learned group, the dungeon wasn't too bad, but the difficulty in this dungeon rises from the learning curve it presented more casual players and how poorly it scaled once you reach the 15+ amount or higher. And at number 8, we have Tol Dagor from Battle for Azeroth. Tol Dagor, like most dungeons, was the typical Mythic Plus with challenging bosses and difficult trash mobs. The only thing that makes this dungeon stand above other dungeons in terms of difficulty is during its entire existence in BFA, it was bugged. Tol Dagor would be a multi-level dungeon that you would steadily progress upwards from the basement level. It started with the Sand Queen boss, and there were many intermissions where you cannot damage the boss, making Tyrannical weak much tougher on groups. The dungeon wasn't insanely challenging, and held traditional learning curves throughout its duration, but the bugs this dungeon presented were what really made it challenging. These bugs would never be removed, and the most noticeable of them was when casting AoE abilities, notably Starfall. What would happen is mobs on levels above and below that were previously not pulled could be hit by your AoE abilities and be pulled into your range and cause wipes rather quickly. It made players play much more cautiously and intentionally not use certain AoE spells to not accidentally pull NPCs and cause wipes or add too much enemy forces percentages to go up. Oftentimes the mobs would get stuck and not even be able to be attacked by players, and they would just float in the air. Eventually the mobs would either reset or just snap to the player's location and start attacking everything they see, adding more stress to groups and could destroy pug groups for those uninformed about the buggy nature of the dungeon. Though the dungeon itself wasn't too hard, being paranoid constantly pulling an entire dungeon's deadliest mobs to you because you press an ability you thought was safe is very punishing. Because everyone has to either just pull everything and waste time in killing extra mobs, or hope their abilities don't pull the mobs they can't actually see. It earns a spot on this list. If Tol Dagor ever makes a return in the dungeon pool for players, it would surely not see as much difficulty if Blizzard managed to completely squish the bugs that caused the mobs everywhere to be pulled by performing your AoE rotation. And at number 7, we have the Grimrail Depot from Warlords of Draenor. Similar to the Temple of Jade Serpent, this dungeon was made available in Mythic Plus format once again, but only in Shadowlands Season 4. Grimrail Depot already had a challenge mode, improved for Mists of Pandaria, so reworking it wasn't insanely costly or different as opposed to the changes the Jade Serpent dungeon saw. What made this dungeon so difficult, however, were the incredibly awkward camera angles players would be forced into, and the very cramped space to fight trash and bosses. After you defeat the first boss, players would be prompted to board a train and you would fight through packs of trash mobs like any other dungeon upon the moving train. While you were inside the train, the camera would give you very limited viewing space due to the small environment you were in combat with. It made locating dangerous spells and avoiding mechanics much more difficult for the average player, and could just result in wipes if you weren't careful enough. In addition, almost every affix worked against the design of this dungeon. Affixes weren't a thing yet in World of Draenor, and the inclusion of small things such as Fortified and Tyrannical could make or break keystones. The most notable of difficult affixes on players was quaking. Every so often, all players would be marked with a circle, and after a few seconds delay, anyone standing within the circle would be interrupted from any spellcast that would be performed and take a chunk of damage. Because everyone was already close to each other and trying to see many other mechanics on the floor in the small space, quaking could just one-shot your entire group and cause a reset. This dungeon was very often avoided by all players because it was just generally unfun for all levels of players to attempt, and no one liked the small space they were confined to. What makes it worse is the second boss had a mechanic where he would enter a cannon and fire it at players while endless swarms of ads would chase you. These ads would drop bombs and you could enter your own cannon to fire it upon the boss's zone to remove it from it and continue the fight and kill him. The problem with this is that a lot of players didn't understand what this mechanic was, and only saw they could attack the cannon itself. This would result in very long fights with this boss and people trying to learn how it works on the spot with no communication, and you could spend 5 to 10 minutes on it and still wipe, having to restart the entire thing. Generally, this dungeon wasn't favored by many and was typically avoided as much as possible, even if it did become easier with learning its mechanics, because it was just an unfun experience. And at number 6, we have Mist of Tirna Scythe from Shadowlands. Mist would only be a 3-boss dungeon, but each boss had very large health pools and long fight times, even when it was on non-Tyrannical week. From the very beginning, Mist posed players with trash mobs that each required attention for either a kick or stun to stop their deadly casts. They could shred tanks and DPS almost instantly if you weren't careful, and players would often use abilities like Bloodlust on just them in order to get past. This dungeon had the potential to wipe groups from the very beginning, and even the smallest misplay was punished very heavily here. You could fail the key almost instantly if the first pull went wrong because you had used Bloodlust already but wiped the process. Mist required very optimal play, and the first boss continued this trend. Ingra Moloch would require you to damage the Droma he had with him to make Ingra actually vulnerable to extra damage, as Ingra himself had a massive health pool that would take far too long to bring down if you only fought him. He'd eventually cast an 80% shield on himself regardless, meaning you had to damage the ad. When you would begin to reach the higher levels of this keystone, if you didn't kill Ingra in at least 2 to 3 phases of his vulnerable damage, you would almost certainly not time the key, as it took far too long to kill him. After this boss, you'd be presented throughout a maze and you must stand near 4 small wooden pillars. Standing near them would reveal an icon, and when revealing all 4 icons, you must find the one that doesn't have a matching trait with all the others. As an example, if 3 of the icons have a circle and 1 does not, this means that the one without the circle is the correct path you must go to in the way to progress the dungeon. Typically, players would install weak auras or have a designated player finding the correct path while everyone else just fights the pack in the new room. It definitely added extra time to the run, and Blizzard was very sure throughout its history to make many of the weak auras that solved the maze to not work as the dungeon went throughout its existence. Even after you finally got through the maze, you had a boss at the very end waiting for you, and she would continue the same mechanic the maze had, and you would need to find the correct version of her amongst the various fakes during the encounter. The timer was very unforgiving, and many keys would be completed within under 30 seconds remaining. The trash leading to the third boss was very intense as well, constantly having to watch the ground so you wouldn't be knocked off the small islands, and prevented the mobs from casting a strong HP shield and healing themselves constantly while high damage is going out almost always. When it came to the final boss, there wasn't much to worry about other than the massive health pool it had, unless you were melee. The hitbox of this boss was super finicky, and most of the time you had to be basically inside the boss to actually be within range to hit, making seeing certain mechanics pretty difficult to locate and avoid to not die. The dungeon was very hit or miss for many players. The casual players could enjoy this dungeon quite a bit and not feel the pressure of playing perfectly, but even at the 11+ range and onward, you would start to feel the effects and need to step up your learning game. And at number 5, we have Uldaman Legacy of Tyr from Dragonflight Season 2. This dungeon would have a very similar issue as Grimrail Depot, where the space in fighting the bosses and trash was generally pretty small, and created awkward camera angles and difficult to dodge mechanics, especially with certain affixes. Uldaman, in comparison, however, was 5 total bosses instead of 3, with much more trash to deal with and a larger runtime than every other entry so far. Uldaman only had a 35-minute timer, which means about every 6 to 7 minutes you must be killing a boss or have already killed it to keep up and not fail the key. From the beginning, it starts easy, with the Lost Dwarves boss, where the only deadly mechanic is dodging fire on the ground and causing melee to stop DPS for a moment to actually avoid the damage. However, many groups would actually go to Bromok, the second boss, first, because Bloodlust and other big cooldowns could be better utilized on him rather than the dwarves. Bromok had a mechanic where if you took too long to kill his totem, he would bloodlust himself in the ads he spawned because there was no way to stop the cast other than to kill his totem and to stun him with it. This creates careful cooldown playing with your group and could very easily have your healer run out of mana if you take too long to defeat the ads and the boss himself if your damage cannot be met, resulting in an already failed key. The trash afterwards must be kited by tanks, but aggro must be held as they have a ramping damage buff that can also one-shot even the most geared players if they aren't careful. You can also remove this debuff by stunning the mob enough times so it cannot recast the buff on itself. Once you reach the third boss, you must carefully plan moments to stun the boss like the trash before to optimally take less damage, but also prevent the boss from gaining a power increase too many times when stunning it. Progressing the bosses ahead is similar as every trash pack now has LOS mechanics, casts that need to be interrupted, and dispels unfriendly targets to keep everyone active. Each pack is pretty massive too, excluding safer pulls altogether and encouraging more dangerous play because of the small timer in the massive dungeon. Even the last few packs have very dangerous threat levels and had to be approached very cautiously. Notably, the stolen time cast from the Time Reaver mobs, making you play cautiously with only minutes to spare on your timer. Overall, the dungeon gets its difficulty from its long running times, awkward spaces when fighting mobs, lots of trash pulls, and a higher boss count than most dungeons in the entire game. It's generally an avoided dungeon by many players and has a completion rate lower than almost every Dragonflight Season 2 dungeon. And at number 4, we have the Azure Vault from Dragonflight Season 1. In the beginning of Dragonflight, this dungeon was immediately heralded as one of the toughest dungeons in the entire game. The mechanics were very unforgiving and hit like a truck on all levels, making everyone talent very defensively and aid their healers as much as possible at the cost of damage. It was also very interrupt heavy, meaning that if you had a group with much longer kick cooldowns like Priest Silence, you could miss important casts and get members of your group killed. It made group composition much more important for interrupts and stuns overall, and if your group lacked, you would surely have a much harder time in the dungeon. Almost every single pack in the dungeon had a gimmick to it that must have been handled or it would cost your life of your members rather quickly. An example of this was the Rune Seal Keeper, who would occasionally root you if not kicked. If this happened, you would likely be subjected to many other mechanics on the floor that you're normally supposed to dodge, hitting you and killing you. But because group composition was so important, you had to decide what was priority to kick and what was safe to allow to be cast by enemy mobs for your group. It required quick thinking and strategy that pugs almost could never replicate effectively, usually just killing the group and causing a wipe or a failed key due to a lever. On the second boss, Azure Blade, she would occasionally summon an ad that cast strong bolts at players that can be interrupted. The problem with this ad is that if your group was unaware and you were tanking, you could turn the boss and accidentally hit them with the frontal cleave ability she casts and one-shot someone like your healer. It made you purposefully wait to move the boss and indirectly not tank a mob you're supposed to because of the danger you might pose to your members. The only real solution to this was to call for range interrupts on the ad or have a Death Knight death grip the mob into the boss for optimal play. After the second boss, it became very well known that trash fall on it was even worse than what came before. It was almost impossible in higher keys to effectively clear the trash and get to the third boss without at least a few deaths, if not a wipe with your group. Traditionally, after the second boss died, players would turn around and go the direction they came and would be able to hug the wall of the entrance to the boss room. You could skip all the trash ahead and jump directly to the third boss if done correctly. This strategy alone shows that no matter the level key you're doing, the effective strategy was just to not interact with the mobs at all and just kill the next boss. It separated many unknowing players from the learned of the skip because many times when attempting to kill the difficult trash, you would just wipe and have players leave the keystone or take too long, failing the key. Any dungeon that basically requires outside knowledge definitely increases its difficulty due to the learning curve. But once the skip was figured out, the dungeon became more bearable for all players. But even the fourth boss was still challenging. During the fight, you must dodge swirly effects on the ground and kill crystal ads that shatter from the boss's body. If you do not kill these crystals in time, they will explode and most likely kill your group by leaving a dot that many healers cannot keep up with. Azure Vault is generally disliked because it brought insanely difficult levels of play to a game, and even after many nerfs, it remained one of the least completed keystones in all of Dragonflight Season 1. Though, since the skip existed and trivializes a lot of the danger, it only earns a number 4 spot on this list and no higher. And at number 3, we have the Shrine of the Storm from Battle for Azeroth. With the largest timer on this list, Shrine of the Storm would be a staggering 42-minute long dungeon. The size of this dungeon was so massive that it was almost literally the size of other zones outside of instance content. On top of this, every single boss and trash mob had very challenging gimmicks to overcome, and pug groups could very rarely complete this dungeon. It was avoided by a lot of the community, and it's easy to understand why. There would also be a mini boss encounter in the dungeon that had a massive health pool in contrast to other trash, and had its own mechanics that must be dealt with. The most obvious of these picks was Rune Carver Sorn, who would cast Carve Flesh on enemies, which must be soaked with the minor reinforcing ward. Many players, even years after the dungeon had been out, wouldn't understand what the mechanics of this mob did, and would often just die within a few seconds of the cast and slow groups down tremendously. Though, the real group killers of this dungeon were the third and fourth boss for pugs. Infamously, Lord Stormsong halted non-communicative groups with his Awaken the Void ability. This caused void globes to chase all the members during the encounter endlessly, and if they made contact with you, they would almost always one-shot you or kill players around you. In order to deal with these orbs, one player will be made unfriendly by the boss with the Ancient Mindbender. The player would become hostile to everyone, but could now tank the damage from the orbs, and when taking enough damage, they would be freed and wouldn't be mind-controlled fully in the process. If players failed to do this, they would be mind-controlled and basically cause a wipe, as without someone to soak the orbs or deal damage to the boss, it was impossible. Pugs very often could not perform what was needed for this boss, and it was here, roughly already 30 minutes or so into the dungeon, players would fail and have wasted their time. On the final boss, this was further amplified. Occasionally, the boss would summon adds and send everyone into a down phase. There would be 2 adds for the DPS to kill, and these adds would perform a long duration cast that if completed would heal it to full. You cannot return to the main phase until all the adds are dead in this phase, and the tank is essentially useless as they have to constantly kite an add on them away, as it does heavy melee damage that can kill any geared tank in just a few hits. The reason the adds that could heal were such a problem is without any true communication from your group, these casts would go off for possibly minutes at a time, and your healer would run out of mana trying to keep everyone alive. You had to communicate when you would kick and could not allow kicks to be missed. The easier method was to focus one at a time, but sometimes players would entrust their members too much to kick it for them and then nothing happens, leaving it at full health. Alongside this, there's lots of dodging mechanics happening and the fight is just overall chaotic. Shrine of the Storm is viewed very negatively by the player base, but it also existed in a time where Mythic Plus was still relatively new to all players, and learning how it works was challenging to all. It doesn't help that most every affix in this dungeon made it significantly worse, no matter what the affix was, in a time where there were much more challenging existing affixes and with little to no nerfs upon them yet. And at number 2, we have the Ruby Life Pools from Dragonflight Season 1. Ruby Life Pools was a 30-minute long timer and had 3 bosses. This dungeon wasn't very different from the previous entries on this list. It had challenging bosses and mechanics on trash and wasn't actually a very large dungeon to scale on foot. The reason it lumps itself at number 2, however, is because this dungeon had gone through so many nerfs through its existence in Season 1. HP percentages nerfs on bosses, and almost every ability throughout the dungeon received a nerf or was just flat out removed. Even after all these nerfs, this dungeon was still viewed as one of the hardest in its rotation when it came to the higher levels. Many runs would require you to perform perfectly, and mechanics could just straight up one-shot you if you weren't careful enough. Casual players reaching the higher levels of this key couldn't understand the scaling and would generally avoid this dungeon. Fortunately, this dungeon was pretty fun to most players, and part of its challenge was the fun. The most notable example of this would be the second boss, Kokia Blazehoof. You would be forced to avoid her Molten Boulder and Ritual Blaze Binding. You would need to strategically place the fire in locations that wouldn't wall yourself from the rest of the group, and even the smallest misstep could be punished with insanely high damage, or just death in a few seconds. It added high thrills to the boss and made players use their quick thinking skills to complete the dungeon further in advance. Generally, it's regarded as one of the better dungeons from Dragonflight, but as it scaled higher, it became nearly impossible unless you had the perfect group composition and strategies. Additionally, it was nerfed like crazy, and the dungeon needed many nerfs on top of more nerfs, make it earn a high spot on this list because of how dangerous it is and was after its changes. And finally, at number 1 on this list, we have the Vortex Pinnacle, added as a Mythic Plus dungeon in Dragonflight Season 2. Vortex Pinnacle was originally added back in Cataclysm, and never saw the real interactions of challenge modes or even a Mythic mode at all until Dragonflight came around. This dungeon, like Temple of the Jade Serpent and Grimrail Depot, would receive large reworks in its bosses and trash mobs alike to bring it more into the modern version of WoW state. Vortex, from the beginning, was revered as incredibly difficult during its first few weeks of existence in the Mythic Plus season because it had gone generally untested by players during PTR. It was released not in a buggy state, but just overtuned, and when reaching the higher keystone levels, even now, players in maxed out item level gear can just lose half their health or be one-shot by certain mobs with no true counterplay. The only solution for most classes, if applicable, is to stun them as many times as possible and stay on top of interrupts. No combination of affixes really helped this dungeon appear any better to players, and even if you just stuck Fortified or Tyrannical into the affixes, you would still be prompted with insanely deadly mechanics. Vortex is viewed as the hardest dungeon in Dragonflight Season 2 by far, and is speculated among many to be the hardest ever. For the general player base, relearning a dungeon again proved challenging for many people because old habits must now be broken, and you'll be put into an unfamiliar position. The second boss, for example, was given an entirely new ability that must be jumped over by using the tornadoes of the flight, intentionally flinging yourself into damage to avoid a mechanic that would cause even more harm than the tornado. The entire dungeon is chaotic, and every mob has the ability to chunk your health like crazy. What's worse is most players just don't like the dungeon either. No mechanics are really fun or engaging, and even when playing well, your character can just be killed instantly because your pug group forgot to kick one cast. Vortex would receive a lengthy sum of nerfs during its run as well, earning it extra points in the difficulty department. Even at the very highest level of players, Vortex Pinnacle sees the lowest completion rate compared to all the others, and is avoided as much as possible by everyone. Blizzard would learn many lessons from attempting to place an old Cataclysm dungeon to the pool, and players can only hope they can improve things for people to look forward to certain keystones regardless of the week. Alright, and that's the list. This list isn't going to pertain to every single WoW player, as everyone has different experiences in the game, especially based on those they play with. Hopefully this list helps inform players about how difficult certain dungeons were and are, as it was generally made for the overall population of WoW players, being ones that only play a few times a week. Were there any entries on this list that you disagree with? If so, please let us know down in the comments below, and we'd love to know your reasoning.